Hello, everyone. Welcome to EDU 5276, which is the assessment course in special education. My name is Dr. Chamblin, and I am so appreciative of all of you that have introduced yourself in the beginning of this course. So we'll be together for the next 13, 14 weeks talking about assessment and how assessment is used in the special education process. I myself have been at Molloy for almost 19 years. And prior to coming to Molloy, I worked for Planned Parenthood. I have been a Peace Corps volunteer, and I worked for the Ministry of Health in Sierra Leone, West Africa. I worked in the foster care system in New York City and on Long Island, and I was a part of a team that brought the very first therapeutic foster care program to Long Island and the Bronx at a time where the New York State Office of Health downsized their facility for children. And the goal was to take these children with many obstacles and challenges that they had. And they were in mental institutions, and to take them and put them into families and put them into the community so they could be in a more naturalized setting. And so I worked with the foster care system. I worked with therapeutic foster care. I trained parents on how to handle these very difficult children. And I also then became a teacher. I have worked in middle school as a self-contained teacher. I have worked in elementary schools as a resource room teacher. And those experiences brought me also to Molloy, where I have continued not just to teach graduate students, but also engage in many projects, spanning projects in middle schools, projects with students with learning disabilities, students with autism, students with emotional behavioral disorders, on a variety of subjects, all pointing to inclusive settings and how can we help students achieve the most that they can. So let's talk a little bit about assessment. And the first thing I'd like you to do is give yourself 10 seconds. And I want you to write down as many things as you can think of that are measured. Any way, whether it's by cups, centimeters, liters, miles, anything. Ready? And go. Okay, so you should have a few things written down on your paper or in your head if you didn't get a chance to write it down. And so there's an old saying that anything important is measured. Time. Some of you had time, money, weather, weight. That's a biggie because we're always on that scale trying to say, oh, did I gain a couple of pounds? So we value learning in education. And so we try to measure all aspects of it. We try to measure all aspects of the educational system because we value it. We value it and we want to know how are we doing. And we have a lot of other things that we want to know, but we'll get to that. So in special education, we have many decisions to make and we use assessments to guide us. So basically, what is assessment and how is it defined? So assessment is the process of gathering information for the purpose of making a decision. We don't assess just generally to do it. Psychologists don't just do an IQ test just for fun. We don't give assessments randomly. Anything we do in assessment, we're doing it because there's a decision to be made. And usually it's a very important decision, and we're looking for evidences to help us make the right decision. So just to reinforce what I've said, we gather information to make decisions about if a student has a disability, if the student meets the federal criteria of a disability, if a student is entitled to services, what type of services that should be, if those services are effective, and if the student is reaching the IEP goals and benchmarks. Assessment is an ongoing process in special education, and we use various tools and methods. So that's a whole lot. Just in the very beginning, we have to figure out, well, does the student have a disability? And if they do have a disability, does it fit within the federal definition of disability? And if it does, then is the student eligible for services? And if they do get those services and we create and we program that for the student and they're engaged, is it working? Is the program working? Is the student moving forward? All of these hinges on some type of assessment. So type of decisions that we make. So taking all of that I just said and kind of breaking it down, the decisions we make. First, identification. Does the student have a school-related problem due to a handicapping condition? That's really important. First, is it a school-related problem? I have worked with a number of students where parents had to get something called a PINS petition, where the parents had to go to the court and ask for support because their child at home and in the community was experiencing difficulty or exhibiting behavior that might have been considered delinquent, harmful. However, those students, when they arrived at school, no problems. They were fine. So right there, that sort of halts the process because it's not school related. It's not a school related problem. And then we have to determine if it's due to a handicapping condition. If a student has not been in school and they're absent all the time, that's not a handicapping condition. If a student does not speak English at home and has very limited English proficiency, there's a concept, BICS and CALPS. So when you're acquiring a second language, your common language, playground language develops much quicker than your academic vocabulary. So you might have a student who's really struggling, but they speak English and you don't understand, well, what's the problem? That's not a handicapping condition. That's a second language acquisition issue. And so we have to first figure that out. And we can use assessment. We use assessment. We gather data and information to figure out, well, is it due to a handicapping condition? If we think it is, and we move forward in making those decisions, is that condition specified under federal regulation, and can we test to find eligibility? So going back to those 13 categories of disability that you've learned about in, I think, 55275 or in your other courses, it has to fit in one of those 13 boxes. If it doesn't fit in one of those 13 boxes, it's not specified under federal regulation. So we have to determine, does it fit? And of course we have OHI, other health impaired, which really takes in a lot of different situations, different disabilities, different conditions, different handicapping conditions, different medical conditions that will cause handicap conditions. And so we have to test for it and we have to figure that out. Then we use assessment to set up programs. So we have to gather data to figure out what programs will meet the needs of the student, what goals do we need to set up for the student, and then we monitor the student's progress. So the student isn't placed in the program and then we just the expectation is for the student to just be there. We have to monitor the progress. How is the student doing? And is all of this working? Is this the right program for the student? Many times as a resource room teacher, I had to call for an IEP meeting. This program is not working for the student. It's either the student may need more services, additional service, a different setting, because there are certain needs that are not being met and what we're providing isn't supporting the student. So when a student is referred or we're thinking about beginning this process, there are three main areas that always come up. And first is academic problems. Does the student have an academic problem? Are they not performing as well as they can or expected? Or behavioral problem, which is biggie. And assessment and behavior problems is a big issue for the overrepresentation of students who do not behave in the way in which very subjectively are expected to. And that has definitely, we've had a long history of in areas where we need to improve in our assessment of behavior problems, because sometimes it's not. A behavior problem can be a behavior problem, but there can be behavior problems related to a disability. Those two things are not the same. If you have behavior issues, doesn't mean you have a disability. It can mean a lot of things. So we need to test and make sure before we start saying kids have emotional behavior disorders that they do, and not that it's based on many other things. Also, we have physical problems. So a student might be experiencing some type of sensory issue, hearing, motor. So I'm putting my hands up. So you might have a student who you notice is if you have a sheet of paper, you have to write on the paper. And so you'll have a student that will maybe start writing, switch hands, and then start writing, can't cross midline, can't do this. There might be a car outside and you have a student who does this. Younger children might not be able to walk from carpet to the floor. So there's a ways in which individuals experience the environment in very atypical ways. All of us may hear within a particular realm. And so when we perceive hearing, we perceive it in the common ways. There are some individuals who don't perceive hearing and sound the same way as the rest of us. And so that impacts their life, and that then becomes an area that we need to help them, because it can cause handicaps, and it can cause them to be disabled. Motor problems, hearing, and hearing, there's hard of hearing, hearing impaired, but there's also hearing sensory that kind of bleeds into different disabilities. So for example, the way you perceive sound, the way you perceive vowel sounds. So there are some individuals who have auditory perceptual issues or visual perceptual issues where they can hear and they can see, but the way they hear and perceive things are very atypical. I was tutoring a student who had a cognitive intellectual disability, but was very at the highest end of that. And I was tutoring him, teaching him how to read. And one day he said to me, he said, you know, if you could just tell me how to get the letters to stop moving in the book, then you'll really be doing a good job. And so I asked him, I said, what, the things are moving for you? He goes, yeah, they're not moving for you. I says, no, the letters are still. He was, well, the letters have never been still. They're never still for me. That's not, and then I had to go back and find his file and go back And the information was there, the assessment data was there, but it was never brought to my attention. And so the way he perceived type, letters, was atypical, constantly moving and atypical, but there are a lot of individuals who do experience that. And so letters are moving, or you might have a student who will write letters just in a string, just no spaces. So the way their visual perception works is a little different. So we notice that. And those are the three top areas for which we start to think there's a handicapping condition. There's an academic problem, there's a behavior problem, or there's a physical problem. Okay, kind of assessment procedures. So we have formal strategies. We have standardized and normed reference tests. So when we talk about assessment tools and what happens in the traditional process where the student is assessed with particular tools, those tools are normed reference tests. And we're going to get into those and talk a lot about those. And it's a formal strategy. Then we have informal strategies such as observations, your curriculum-based assessments, use of informants, sometimes filling out. Use of informants can sort of fall into both categories, but for now, we're just going to call it an informal strategy. Classroom tests, those type of things are informal strategies. They're just as important, but when we do our assessment procedures, it's like taking a picture of a student. It's a snapshot. The more snapshots you take, the more you get to see the different sides of an individual. And so that's why we have formal strategies, we have informal strategies, so that we can kind of understand what's going on with the student. So the assessment model question, this is the thinking. So when we think about what we have, this situation in special education. And so we have an assessment process. We have a student. And so we're about to start this process where we're gathering information so that we can then make all these decisions around, does the student have a disability, right? So the assessment model question is sort of like a list of thinking it through. So the first thing we're starting to think about, is there a school performance problem? Is it related to disability? What are the students' educational needs? So I had a student, she was in 2nd grade. She came into the school, she was new to the school, and immediately, there was no RTI at this point. Well, we had academic intervention services, but the school hadn't adopted RTI because it was really a little bit before RTI's time. And immediately, the teachers referred her. Immediately, she was there for like 3 days and they referred her. And it was like, are you kidding me? This is ridiculous. And so eventually, very early on, we had the conversation and the mother said, my daughter was in a horrible school and they did not teach her anything. She sat in the back, she was quiet, she disengaged, she was just there. She has 100% attendance. She learned nothing. No one believed her. And so she ended up getting services. I worked with her and I taught her how to blend sounds. In 2nd grade, she did not fully understand the difference between a letter and a word. I was shocked. You're in 2nd grade. You don't know that when you put all of these things together, it's a word and these are letters. She had a lot of confusion about that. Worked with her on reading and blending and did it in a kinesthetic way. And I used blocks so that you take the words and you scoop the sounds. So some of you know Foundations and Wilson, but this was just using blocks, just colored blocks, and let's scoop the sounds. And then we scoop them with our body. And so we left the blocks. And so she would sound out words. And then I would see her in the class silently reading, and she would be doing this the whole time. And the teacher's like, what is she doing? I said, she's scooping the sounds. She's getting it. She had services for a year and a half, and she was declassified. So did she have a disability? Probably not. And I really do believe her mother was 100% on point when she tried to describe what was happening. And it worked out either way. But we really have to think about, well, what are the educational needs? Because we do not want to label kids with handicaps and disabilities that don't have them, because it's not ethical. We do want to give them help and we want to give them services, but we don't want to mislabel individuals. So what are the educational needs? We need to know that. What is the relationship of the learning problem to classroom success and classroom demands? And again, is there a misconnection? Is there something that is developmentally inappropriate about the classroom demands? Is there a piece in there that is just something that we can work on that really is not in the domains of disability? That also comes up. One of the things that I didn't say in my introduction, I was also an interim chair for the Committee on Special Education for one of the districts that I worked in. And many times classroom teachers came in and said, the student is not doing well at all. They were not meeting any of the demands very well. And then when we collect the information and we used our normed reference assessments and other pieces, and we tested for particular disabilities, the student wasn't disabled, but they needed help, and there were issues that needed to be addressed. And so that was always one of the hardest things for teachers to understand. And it's not every student has a disability that is not meeting the classroom demands. Also looking at the relationship of the learning problem to medical, social, or cultural factors. And that's also major, that sometimes the learning problem may have its roots in something else. I just gave the example of a student whose home language may be it may be non-English, and so coming into school, there may be certain things that exhibit as a learning problem, but actually isn't. It's not a learning problem. It's a misunderstanding in how the student learns, and so there's like a misfire. And we have to step back and look at those cultural factors, culture of the student, culture of the home, culture of the neighborhood, culture, pop culture too. There might be other things that are affecting this. And so these are all things that we have to take into consideration, because we're saying whether the student has a disability or not. That is absolutely major, because a disability is something that person that should be organic and is a part of that person's profile of who they are. And it's not to fix disability, but it's to understand who they are with the disability and how we can assist and help. So to say someone has a disability, again, is a major step. And then to not do our due diligence as professionals to make sure that we know what we're doing is extremely unprofessional and not ethical at all. Okay, so this slide, I know I have it twice. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe I have it 3 times. Let's see what's going on here. Okay, so now with special situations, a pandemic, COVID, the steps in the process will be very different. RTI also has brought a new way to bring these steps forward. So here I'm going to do a national basic steps in the assessment process. This is not in stone, but this is the fundamental way in which we look at the steps. And of course, things are flexible based on where you are in the country and based on the time. So first thing we do is we assess what is happening in the classroom. So the first step is to consider how the student is performing in relation to the content, the instructional environment, classroom management, learning management. At this step, we also investigate general education services such as AIS, and the student has been involved in some type of RTI initiative and is starting to be involved in going from a lower tier to a more intense tier. First step. The second step, should in RTI, they're moving through the more intensive steps and they're coming down to a part where they're not responding to intervention, or in an AIS basic model, they receive remedial services or whatever this general ed has to offer. And so we need to move forward. So then the second step, we have identification and referral. And what happens in this step is the student is identified as we suspect that there is a disability. So we suspect that there is a disability, and we usually have an idea about the parameters of it. So clearly, if we're suspecting that it's a learning disability, we're not testing for orthopedic impairment. So we kind of have an idea of what's going on. The student is then referred for evaluation after receiving parental consent. Sounds real obvious to all of us here, was not always the case. Parents can say no. So you have to have parental consent always. Well, there are some exceptions, but you must receive parental consent. It has to be an extreme case where you would engage in this process and do it without parental consent, and quite extreme. So a list of assessment tools for the testing are selected. So we have the individualized assessment plan. So that is when usually the school psychologist will say, these are the tests, the assessment tools that we're going to use because we kind of think that it's a disability, and we kind of think that it is this type of disability, or we think it's this. So we might have an individualized assessment plan that says the WIAT, which is the Wechsler Individual Achievement Tests. Oh, I almost forgot that. Or it might be the Kaufman, or it might be a Woodcock-Johnson. So all of these are tests for achievement. And then we might have a test of intelligence. We must have a test of intelligence. So it might be like a Stanford-Binet or Wechsler test. And then there might be, we think that this student might have dyscalculia, which is a math learning disability. So we're going to give them something like the Key Math. Another student, we might say, okay, we're going to give them the intelligence test, and we're going to give them the generalized achievement test. But we really feel that they have a processing problem. So we're going to also give them a speech test. So the tests are not always the same that are selected. There might be a student we think they might have ADHD. So we're going to give them a Conners scale, and then we're going to do a behavioral assessment. That's different from another student who we think is a learning disability. So the individualized assessment plan lists what assessments we're going to give to the student. And in most cases, there's an observation in the classroom. We usually talk to parents. And so all of that is usually during our second phase. So we have the social worker usually do a home study, a questionnaire. As a part of that, I don't think I said that, as well as the classroom observations. And once the assessments are completed, and we have gathered the information, a CSE, Committee on Special Education meeting, is arranged, and the multidisciplinary team needs to discuss the evaluation. This team consists of educators included, but not limited to, you must have a chairperson who is an administrator, a school psychologist, a special education teacher, and a general education teacher. That is the minimum that you are supposed to have for this. And of course, the parent or parent representative. Okay, so other professionals may be at the meeting depending on the child's condition. A nurse or a doctor may be requested, especially in the case where it is a medical situation and that doctor or nurse needs to be there at that meeting to inform us to understand what's going on or the results of a particular test. In addition, speech therapists, occupational therapists, or physical therapists may also attend, especially if they've also done a report. So remember, I said the individualized assessment plan. So school psychologist might say, this student has real motor problems. We need to have the occupational therapist administer an evaluation test. And so when we have the meeting, of course, if you have people who are evaluating the child, when we have the meeting, it's nice to have the report, but it's even nicer to have the professional there. So when it's possible, these additional folks are invited to attend, and in a lot of cases, their input is extremely valuable if they can attend, and in some cases they're not, but there is a minimum requirement, which we already discussed on the last slide. Okay, so 3, determination of eligibility. So the team, the CS team, determines if the student meets one of the 13 classifications, and then if he or she is eligible for services. So you could meet one of the 13 classifications, but to the impact of your education, how much is it impacting, becomes a part of the formula. And it's extremely flexible. And that's why it's a team and it's a conversation. And to the degree in which you understand the testing, the evaluation, if you attend a meeting and you understand that, the more you can advocate and the more you can work towards the student receiving the help that they need. I have chaired many meetings, and the differences in teacher preparation and teachers understanding the situation, a lot of times made a big difference because the way they presented the information and presented the student. Parents, the way that they participate in meetings, there are a lot of variables in this. And so for those of us that are in this class, my goal is for you and for us to know as much as we can so we can do the best we can for the students that we serve. So last, or not last, but number 4 is program placement. So the student is placed in the service or in the services, whether it be just speech or ICT or separate school. Locally, we have BOCES. Well, in New York State, we have BOCES, residential care, in a special school. There's a whole continuum of services that can happen. Sometimes we might just have a consultant teacher. We might have an itinerant teacher come in. I worked with a student who had a vision issue, and he had a vision teacher come into the classroom to work with him. So it could be a variety of things, and then we monitor the program. Okay, so there's some legal concerns. And so what I want to do is I want to make this available to you to just sort of look at. And there's textbook pages that are posted. And so I'm not going to go over all of them, but certain cases that are important for you to just keep in the back of your mind. I'm just going to touch upon them extremely lightly because one of the things that we know, due process is something that is major, was not always available, but parents and families should know that they have rights and it safeguards their rights, because prior to due process, parents did not have rights in our educational system. So a lot of times you got to know where we were to know where we are and where we need to go. And so special education history is not all great. There's a lot of things that were done to kids and to families that was unethical and was not done the way it should have been done. So due process is very important. It safeguards the rights of students and parents, and it makes sure that things are fair for them and provides them with protection. And so when you look at the process, due process is embedded in it for a reason. And so public law specifies that all students with disabilities have the right to a free, appropriate public education, and that schools must have an individualized education plan for each student with a disability. So that we know is FAPE, free, appropriate public education, because students with disabilities were not always granted that. So protection in evaluation procedures. When we look at the history of evaluation procedures, there's some dark moments in our educational history. So the following requirements were designed to protect students and help ensure that assessment procedures and activities would be fair, equitable, and non-discriminatory, to make sure you are engaged in this lecture. Try to correct the misplaced word in each sentence that describes a requirement in the evaluation procedure. So get a piece of paper and write the numbers 1 through 8. And so I'm going to show you, and I'm going to read a couple of sentences that are from the protection and evaluation procedures, and let's see how much you know, okay? So let's treat it like it's a little game, okay? Ready? Yay! Got your paper? Got a pen? Come on, I know, go get it. I know you sitting there saying, oh, I'm just gonna go through this part really fast. Okay, so you're going to correct the statement. And you know that something is not so right with what is written in red, okay? So let's look at the first thread. Tests are to be selected and administered so as to be racially and culturally discriminatory. To the extent feasible, students are to be assessed in English. Tests must have been validated for any purpose for which they are used. So look at the words in red. Change them. What should it say? So, number 1, tests are to be selected and administered so as to be racially and culturally non-discriminatory. We have a history of evaluating students and being extremely discriminatory, and coming up with theories, ideas, labels for students based on racial and cultural insensitivities. And we're not going to move forward that way in education for the future. So it should be non-discriminatory. Number 2, to the extent feasible, students are to be assessed in their primary language or mode of communication. So if a student speaks Spanish, we want to assess them in Spanish. Now, Does that create some problems with our normed reference assessments? Yes, it does. Those tests are normed reference, and Spanish speakers are not part of the sample. So do we compromise the test? Yes. However, when I give the student that formal or norm reference assessment tool, and I'm doing the Wyatt, the Kaufman, the key math, the Woodcock-Johnson, the Tactile, when I'm doing that, I'm making sure that they understand what's being asked of them. And then I'm also recording what I see and what I know about the student. So recording notes during assessment is just as important as a final score. And if you do it in English and the student does not read English, does not understand English, is very weak on it, you're definitely not going to get a right score. So when we are trying to get as close as possible to understanding what the student knows. So if a student speaks Mandarin, and I know that they speak Mandarin and they speak it at home, and I'm trying to assess them, then we need to find somebody who speaks Mandarin so that they can translate it so we can see where we stand. We have an overrepresentation of students with who are ENL in special education. And a lot of it is because of we're not taking the time to do the process in a professional and ethical way. And before the student is even referred, we need to back the wagon up. And there's a lot that we need to do and understand for our ENL students. Why do we need them to be in special education when the services, the teaching methodology, all of those things can be available not in special education? So these are the things that we need to think about and we need to work for the students. 3, tests must have been validated for any purpose for which they are used, and tests must have been validated for the specific purpose for which they are used. So if there is a formal assessment, a normed based assessment, I said the key math, it is a test to measure math. And so it has to be a reliable assessment and it has to be validated. And that is through a statistical process that is also that this test, given this test to students over and over again, it is reliable, that their responses will be within the same range and that it is valid. It does test math concepts that it says it tests. A reading test does test the concepts of reading that it says it tests. So we have to make sure those tests are reliable and validated, reliable and valid. Okay, next one. Let's see if we can get, okay, this slide has 2. Okay, number 4. Teachers must be administered, tests must be administered by teachers in conformance with the instructions provided by the test provider. 5, tests used with students can include those designed to provide information about specific educational needs and not just a general intelligence quotient. Okay, read that to yourself one time and change what is in red. Four. So what do you think? Instead of teachers, what do you think it should be? Okay. I hear you thinking. It's coming to me. I'm feeling it. Okay. So some of you are right, and some of you are a little bit off. But teachers, I keep saying teachers, tests must be administered by trained personnel. So you have to be trained in the area of the test. So special education teachers can give the Kaufman, the Wyatt, any achievement test because they've taken an assessment course. Intelligence tests are usually given by psychologists. Speech tests are usually given by trained speech pathologists. Occupational tests are usually given by occupational therapists. So usually you're trained. There are some tests that can be given by multiple professionals. So a psychologist can give a test of achievement, as well as intelligence. Trained special education teachers at certain level can give a variety of tests. So it's a trained individual. Number 5, instead of can, replace it with must. Must include those designed to provide information about specific educational needs and not just general intelligence quotient. And that's really important because disability in a lot of cases became about IQ, one test, and many students ended up being segregated from the general population in school and segregated, put to the side because they were labeled as mentally retarded and based on one test, which also, again, not best practice. Okay, number 6. Let's see how many is on this slide. 7 and 8. Okay, I think this is the last 3. So take a moment and read it. Decisions about students are to be based on performance on only a single test. Number 7, evaluations are to be made by a multidisciplinary team that includes at least one teacher or other specialist with knowledge in the area of reading. Only students suspected of a learning disability must be assessed in all areas related to specific disability, including where appropriate, health, vision, hearing, social and emotional status, general intelligence, academic performance, communicative skills, and motor skills. So take a moment. So number 6, decisions about students are to be based on performance on, now based on what I said about the intelligence test, should it be only a single test? No, it must be a variety of tests. So that individual assessment plan, remember I spoke about that? There will be a variety of tests on that. You can't just give one test, one snapshot. Could you imagine something so, I want to say trivial, but you went to a photo shoot and you are trying to sell a coat and you take one shot of the coat and the model is in the coat, you take one shot. Okay, that's it. We know everything about that coat. Print. That would be ludicrous. But something even more important, understanding the way a child, an individual learns, even more important, to hinge it all on one single test. Sounds ridiculous, but that was our history. So we make sure we don't do one snapshot and one test, a variety of tests and a variety of information also, okay? Number 7 is evaluations are to be made by a multidisciplinary team that includes at least one teacher or other specialist with knowledge in the area of his or her specialty. Next one. All students suspected of having a learning disability or having a disability must be assessed in all areas. So in all areas related to specific disability, include where appropriate. So health, vision, hearing, those are basics. So you'll find that on almost all students. We do basic general health, information, and schools keep that information. Immunizations, generally how the student is doing. General vision and hearing is done for all students. And when we refer, that needs to be done. And so then we look at social and emotional status to find out where they are. Then we have general intelligence for all students as a baseline, academic performance, and then we look at communication skills and motor skills. In some cases, we don't necessarily do motor skills for all students because we know motor skills might not be at all a part of the issue. So, but when we can, all of these are supposed to be touched upon. And then some of these are not on the individual assessment plan. Some of these are not on that because it's done before. Definitely the vision, the hearing, the social emotional part, all of those are things that are done in practice and aren't necessarily on that because it's done in practice for all students referred. Does that make sense? LRE provision. To the maximum extent appropriate, handicapped children are to be educated with children who are not handicapped, and that special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of handicapped children from their regular educational environment occurs only when the nature or severity of the handicap is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So the goal is, an LRE, is that children are to be educated together. So we talk about inclusion and inclusive environments. They should be educated together. So when you're learning about special education for the first time, and I know some of you are veterans in special education, veterans in your field. And so we have a variety of people who are taking this graduate course. But just for those so that they understand this, that's the goal. And that was the goal of the LRE provision. But when we look at helping students and giving them services, a lot of time we look at, oh, well, more is better. The more services I give, the better the student will be. And then that comes from a very well-intentioned place. The more services you give a student, the more restrictive it becomes. So if you have a student who is in ICT class, so they're in a class where there are two teachers, and there's a general ed teacher, a special ed teacher, and you have a mixture of kids with IEPs and general ed kids. And then you start adding all these pullouts, which is one of the things New York State tried to reduce by making ICT part of the continuum. So you have all these pullouts. The more the student is away from the general ed classroom, the more restrictive their program becomes. And so when you make changes like that, when you make major changes, they're supposed to all go through an IEP meeting. Simple things like there's some places that still use the resource room model. When you go from resource room from 3 hours to 5 hours, the more hours you add, the more restrictive it comes. That's more on the elementary school level. In middle and high school, it becomes a period. So the way it's built in is kind of built in consistently. But when you go from giving a student resource room to a special class, that's more restrictive. A special class with 15 kids to a special class with 12 kids, that becomes more restrictive. A special class in the school building to a special school that is somewhere else, a special ed school somewhere else, that becomes more restrictive. So the goal of the CSE and the goal of the LRE is to make sure that to the extent possible, and of course, for a lot of situations, students will receive what they need in a more restrictive environment, but we want to make sure that that's the case. So we try not to go restrictive. So if a student comes in and we're trying to figure out what they're doing, we don't want to put them in residential care. However, there's a lot of situations where that's what happens because sometimes it's necessary, and sometimes kids need that. So, for example, I've known several families who have done this, but one family in particular that lived in New York City, and they lived in Queens, and they had a child who was multiply disabled, and they wanted their child to go to Viscardi. So if you have never heard of Viscardi and you live on Long Island, just Google the school. The family bought a house 3 blocks away to get into Long Island, which is 3 blocks away. They moved to a town named Elmont, which is on the borderline of Queens and Long Island. And they had their IEP information from New York City. They had their meeting, and they requested Viscardi, and they really made an appeal and for what the student needed. So the student never ever went to the local school. They came in and they went to Viscardi, and it was appropriate. It was what the child needed, but it was definitely coming into a school district and going to the most restrictive placement because that's what needed to be done in that process. But that's not typical of most situations, most cases. So when you have your CSE meeting, that is the goal, is to make sure the LRE provision is adhered to. So the court cases that have helped us get into a better, healthier place, I'm just going to name the cases. The information is here. You can always open this up and just read through the cases or Google them. So these are the things that you should take a look for. Hansen versus Hobson. Oh, also, it's also in the chapters in the reading, if you are so inclined to take a look. So we have Hansen and Hobson, very important case. Tinker versus Des Moines. Mills versus Board of Education. These are all landmark cases that you all probably already familiar with. Diana versus the Board of Education. Coverio Basas, I always say that wrong, versus San Diego. Please forgive me for mispronouncing that particular name. Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Children. That was a major case. And I just kind of talked about it very lightly. Larry P. versus Riles. Parents in Action on Special Education versus Hannon. So all of these cases, so everything that I just said about protection, due process, FAPE, all these things that we kind of now in this day and age intuitively understand that that's the way it should be, just wasn't. And this is sort of the backdrop of cases that have gotten us to where we are, so that we understand the process. Maddie T. Holiday, this was a major one, and because of this individual who sued school district, really brought about phenomenal changes to our educational process in assessment. And so here, just a couple of things to note, like even a timetable for the assessment process. So for all of you, when it comes to timetables and how long something takes, all schools, all districts have a parent handout that they should give to parents that has all this information. And that is part of the process as well, that they have to know their rights and they should know how long something how long it's going to take. And there are timetables for all parts of the process so that they're not dragged out indefinitely. These are some notes on the things that I just said. Please read it with me. Things to consider. This is the last slide. I was trying to make this in under an hour, and right now it's 1 hour and 50 seconds. Okay, so thank you for spending this time with me to go over the very first part of the foundations of assessment, the definition of assessment, the generalized model and the referral process. And when we engage in assessment, and all special education teachers are considered trained personnel to give these tests when a school psychologist can't. I've had students, graduate students, taking this class and who were hired by a school district to be an evaluator, where they're giving the test, and sometimes they don't even know, like, they're like, oh my God, I don't even know how to give the test, and they just threw me into it. So you will be considered trained to give some of these assessments. So what's so important to consider in this? The responsibility for the consequences of one's work. How we assess students has major consequences, because then we are the ones who are saying, this is what we think, where the student is, what they need. I often think about all the students who ended up in misplaced in special education programs. And there were teachers who advocated for that, who pushed for that, and the students end up not where they're supposed to be. And so there are major consequences to that for the child, who then grows up and does not understand exactly what happened there. And so likewise, for those students who did not receive what they needed or help, or one of the most interesting videos. I don't think I didn't assign it for this course. I don't think I assigned it for this course, but our dyslexic children. When you look at children who have dyslexia and in the classroom, in a school, and how so many of them, it just missed. We missed it. And when we pick programs or strategies for them and not picking the correct ones, and how for a lot of them, they're not understanding what's the problem, what's wrong with me, why can't I learn how to read? I'm so bright, but I can't get this mat cat bat thing. Like, why can't I do that? So it's being a teacher, to me, I just feel like it's one of the most important things, being a special educator, even more so, because everything we do has consequences to it. So we want to make sure that we are well educated, we are well prepared, and that we are critical thinkers, and that we really, because every situation that comes up is going to be different. And every time we assess students, it's going to be different. The background is going to be different. So there's no exact formula for every single student. But if we really take the time to understand the process, understand the student, then we can really do better in making sure we come up with the best ideas, plans, support, suggestions possible. Recognizing the boundaries of one's competence. There are things that we don't know. And one of the things that I used to say to a group of teachers that I used to work with is that we are teachers, not fortune tellers. Please stop telling parents and children what they will never do or what they will never become. The boundaries of our competence is not to say, oh, this child will never learn how to read, or this, that's not what we're here for. We're here to try to understand certain things. And when we get to a place where we don't understand all of the parameters, then we seek other professionals. We ask other professionals for their help. And we need to realize that. And sometimes realizing also that as a teacher, we might have, there's certain things we might not understand. And the way that we frame the reality around it might not really be the reality. I've had teachers say, I've tried everything. And a student cannot add, will never learn how to add. And so there's a book, it's called The Prim. I don't know if those of you who have been around might have seen it. And it has, each page has, says, student cannot add double-digit numbers. And there are like 40 suggestions on what to do. So when we used to have our school-based team, and that was another thing I used to do, I was on a school-based team. And I would teach, say, oh, the student will never, I tried everything. I said, well, like there's 40 things here. Can you point to me, which one of these 40 things have you tried consistently? And it was great because teachers really were like, oh, wow, I didn't know. Oh, that's a strategy. I never tried that strategy. Oh, that's great. I didn't know. So the boundary of your competence was that you didn't know what to do. So then don't say that they'll never learn how to do it. We haven't even tried it yet. So that's really important. We need to recognize those boundaries. The information that we receive is confidential. So this is very difficult for teachers also. There are times when a psychologist is given information. That information is confidential, given to the psychologist. Psychologists cannot share it with the teacher. That is definitely something that is a ongoing situation. Teachers find it problematic. It can be problematic. Back at the height of the AIDS epidemic, when I was in schools, and we had students who had HIV, school psychologists couldn't tell us who the student was. And so we had a school meeting. They gave us gloves and said, it gave us gloves and said, you know, we can't say who's HIV positive. And so this is what you need to do. And so it caused a lot of panic, rightfully so, understandably. So that's something that we have to understand and learn how to navigate. How do you navigate the confidentiality of information and know that you have to hold some things private, and that the school psychologist or the administration team might be bound to hold some things private. And it has to do with a student in your class, in your room. You might have a student who the school psychologist recently found was molested, and that information cannot be shared with you. And so you have this child in your classroom who is exhibiting bizarre behavior, and you like can't understand what's happening. And then you go to school psychologist and say, is something happening I should know? And I say, there's some things, but I can't tell you. That's really hard. And it's something to consider, how we deal with that and how we troubleshoot that, because it's something that we can't break. So it's something to consider. I've found it to be very difficult. I've had many students, HIV positive, kids who were molested, kids who had stuff going on at home that was just horrendous, and then would come into school and start exhibiting certain things. I had a parent, I had a situation where there was a student that we had recommended for years that he probably had ADHD. You cannot recommend medication to parents. As a teacher, you should not do that. It's not ethical. But as a team, we asked the parent, please consider all things. Talk to your doctor, talk to everyone, talk to your family, your ministers, everyone in your circle, and look for options. And this parent was a nurse. And she said, I will never, ever put my child on medication. And at one point in time, his behavior changed. It was night and day, changed in my class. And he was going under the tables, he was rolling on the floor, he was talking to people who were not in the classroom. He was talking to people I couldn't see. And so I was like, oh my God, what's going on with the student? He's just like, he's changing. And I don't even, like, first I was thinking, is he playing like a prank? Is he trying to prank me? Because he was a very sweet young man. And then all of a sudden started acting like behavior that was so atypical and out there for him. So I didn't know what was going on, but it was going on for a while. And then it affected him socially, where his friends were fighting with him. And they were fighting during recess because he was doing things that were just not in his personality. And while we sat in a small group, he just started laughing, like, and started talking to the person to his right, and there was no one there. And he was talking and laughing with an imaginary person, which was not like him. And school psychologists couldn't tell me anything. And so fortunately, I had a good rapport with the mom, and I called her and I said, what's going on with Kevin? What's happening? Tell me something, Mom. Let me tell you what he's been doing in class. It's been like 2 weeks, and I thought he was playing around. And so the mother told me, she says, I put him on medication. She said, I know you guys didn't want to tell me I should do it. You kind of beat around the bush, but I finally got to the point where I really see that he needed it. And so starting off medication, as a nurse, she's like, I know that it's not going to be exactly right, and they're going to have to play with it a little bit. She said, but at home, she says his stomach is a mess. He's not sleeping. His behavior is off the wall with this new medication. But she said, but I made the decision. You guys didn't make it for me. You kind of helped me see the light. I made the decision. I'm going to stick with it, and we're going to try different things until we get it right. And it is my pleasure that I stayed in touch with Kevin until Kevin graduated from high school. And it took a lot of tries. He started off with Ritalin, and Ritalin was not for him. They tried a lot of different medication, a lot of different doses, and Kevin graduated from high school, a very successful student. They got it right. And that was the mom's commitment. So confidentiality can be difficult. And I sort of feel like I wish the school psychologist would have told me, but she couldn't. So, and adherence to professional standards. So in all we do in evaluation, because when we evaluate and we're giving numbers to a test, or we're giving that kind of information, there's a level of automatic validity that is given to those tests. And sometimes people put more importance on some of these tests than they actually warrant. And so we need to kind of be able to interpret that, but also in giving tests or interpreting tests, we need to use professional standards in doing that, in administering the test the way they should be, and in giving information in a way that is very credible. So as I mentioned before, there has been a long history that hasn't been so bright in assessment. And so we're at a point where we definitely have much higher standards for ourselves in our profession, and of course, test security. In this course, you're going to see some tests that were posted. Usually in this course, when it's a face-to-face, students administer different tests to each other, or they'll administer the test to a test subject. Right now, in this time of the pandemic and COVID, you are not required to do that for this course. So you will see people giving the test. Sometimes there are older formats for the test, which is even better, because to have a test posted on YouTube, a current edition, that kids can watch that. So that's not good. So having a person administering a former edition, just so that you could see how it's done, that is very helpful. And I think that's a better way to do it. Test security is really important. And I've been in situations where I have tested a particular student who I know was prepped for a normed-based assessment and was trying to do well, because it was an issue of testing that had to do with private school admission, which we use standardized normed reference test to see where the student, how the student was doing. And there was high stakes related to it because he was an out of district placement. And so the mother knew a psychologist, and I could tell that that psychologist had exposed the student to some of the math problems on the particular assessment that I was using. That happens, and that is not helpful, because then we don't get a clear picture. So those things are very much a part of the whole process. Test security is always is an issue. So thank you. And we are at 1 hour, 16 minutes. I hope that wasn't too long. In this course, there won't be a lot of lectures. So we won't have lectures every week. But for this first module, just to get us set up, there will be some lecturing. And I thank you for joining me. And I think that either in the next lecture, but by the end of the module 2, I will hopefully cover all of the quiz questions, cover all the basics, so that you have a good foundation as we move on into some more hands-on activities. So thank you for being with me. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to email me. Thank you. Have a great day.